welcome to BloombergQuint. Now, over the last 2 months or so, there's been a debate that's been playing out about the GST compensation cess that was due to states. The cess has seen a shortfall, and hence it had to be made up in some way. The debate has been who borrows to make up for that shortfall. For a long time, the central government had maintained that states seem to be the ones who will do the borrowing, and then in an abrupt turn of events, yesterday, the central government has finally said that they will do the borrowing and on-lend to states. Joining us to talk about this principally, but also helping us understand some of the technicalities and how this will work on the budget front, is Dr. Rathin Roy. Dr. Roy, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Very kind of you. Let me start, Dr. Roy, with principle in this. I think for a long time, people had argued that if there is a shortfall in the GST compensation cess, just by the way the mechanism was designed, it was for the center to borrow and compensate the states. Do you think with yesterday's statement, at least the center has come halfway into doing the right thing?
Absolutely. And I think it's very welcome that the center has, as you so correctly say, come, I would say, precisely halfway to doing the right thing. I think it is very important when the center has invested political capital, because it's very obvious to me that this was not done. This is not how a bureaucrat thinks. There has been some political input here and a willingness, which is a very political thing, to say that, okay, we will now accept what you have said and we will alter the way we were going to do this. That's a very positive signal that's been sent out in the context of center-state federal relations and especially fiscal relations.
Okay, and I'll come back to those principles in a bit in the broader context as well. I do want your help in understanding how this works. Now, they're saying that, okay, we are borrowing. Firstly, I think just from the mechanism or the technicalities of borrowing, this is simpler, right? The center borrows, they do regular securities, but then they say they on-lend to the state. So on the budget side, how does this work, Dr. Roy?
On the budget side, this would mean that the center would basically be a post office, where the center would borrow, and then it would transfer that borrowing to the states. And when the time for repayment came, if they follow the procedure that is normally followed with external loans, which are also on lent, then the center would recover the principal from the state's account with the RBI. That's the procedure followed there. They have not specified what procedure they will use for this. So I'm assuming that that is the procedure they'll use. If that is so, then it is very clear that this would mean an increase in the liability, the borrowing liability of the states, an increase in the debt, total debt of the states.
Okay, so the center borrows, it will not show up in the center's liabilities anywhere. It doesn't need to, because it then transfer it to states.
It will be matched by a counter asset. So therefore, there will be no net increase in net liabilities, which is equal to increase in debt. Yes.
So they are correct in saying that this doesn't add to the fiscal deficit at the state at the center level.
That is correct.
But it does add to the state fiscal deficit, right? Because they're saying that this is financing of the deficit, so obviously the deficit also goes up.
That is correct.
Okay. So this is
that is important because were an alternative modality to be used, for example, the center borrows, the center then uses that borrowing to pay the GST compensation due to the states, and then the center repays the loan and the interest on the loan, then that would not reflect as a liability of the states. So essentially, the states are incurring a liability because the center has failed to meet its obligation to pay GST compensation cess.
Okay, so you're drawing a distinction between had it been a transfer versus a loan. Had it been a transfer, it would have been on the government, of the central government.
Very correct. Exactly. Better put than I did. And GST compensation is a transfer. So what you're seeing analytically is the replacement of a transfer by a loan. And that is where the center, that is why I'm saying the center has, as you pointed out, only gone halfway.
Okay. Okay. Is it broadly, though, a sort of a compromise solution to your mind? I think we saw some comments from the states who had opposed it yesterday saying that they welcome this, although the larger issue of what happens next year, because this is not the entire compensation amount, remains sort of undecided and undiscussed.
Yeah, what is basically happening is that you are short of revenue to effect a transfer to the subnational unit that was agreed by the former finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, with the states, and that formed the basis of the GST agreement, where the states give up powers. You are not defaulting on that obligation. You are asking in common Bombay parlance, you're asking for a deferral, right? You're asking for a rollover. And obviously, like any rollover, the creditor, in this case the states, lose some money. And the money they're losing is the interest that they have to pay on this, unless it is true, as was said in the first circular, that the I want to comment on this slide in a minute, but
Yeah.
that the GST compensation cess would also be used to pay the interest. In which case, what the states are losing is getting enough GST compensation on time as a trade-off for this borrowing. So let me explain this. So the center borrows, a state borrows 100 rupees because it did not get 100 rupees in GST compensation. Let's say the interest rate is 5%. So then the next year, the GST compensation fund, let's say the collection is X. The net available to distribute to the states for next year's GST compensation would be X minus 5%. So there'll be less than, and then you'll roll it over and roll it over and roll it over, right?
Yeah.
Effectively, is all that is happening. That the cost that is being paid, if this modality is followed, is that the time frame within which the states will get GST compensation is now being staggered.
Yeah.
Right. It's effectively like a moratorium, that's all. And that obviously has a financial cost to the states. But that is one. On the other hand, if the states are expected to pay the interest, on their current account, then that's actually a detraction from state resources. And that would be very unfortunate.
As of now, if we go by the August 29th release, which is the only one which had the options, they said that this interest and the principal will go from the cess amount. So then, the modalities are simpler. The cess anyway is collected by the government. From there, it makes the interest payments and the principal payments.
Absolutely. But it's still an inferior solution to the center acknowledging its liability of not effecting a transfer and therefore bearing the cost of that liability itself, right? So that is why it's very much a halfway house. And there's one more complication here, which is true of any state debt, which I've been pointing out repeatedly. So when the states borrow, they pay interest. Who gets that interest? That interest is got by the holders of state bonds. As you well know, a substantial chunk of these state bonds, not all, but a substantial chunk, are held by public sector institutions, banks, financial institutions, etc. These are owned by the central government. So the interest income that accrues to these institutions increases their top line, right? And increases the total amount, therefore, of money that they have, and therefore potentially increases the revenues of the central government. Ceteris paribus, if nothing else happens, then an increase in such borrowings and the interest on that would increase profits or surpluses, and some of that would accrue back to the central government. So there's a moral hazard problem here. But that is always there for any state borrowing. But here the moral hazard is compounded by the fact that you are forcing the states to borrow, or you're asking the states to borrow instead of a transfer. And you're making money on that borrowing, irrespective of whether it comes out of the GST compensation cess or anywhere else.
Okay, but that won't happen now because the center is borrowing. The securities being issued are central government securities, right?
The securities that are being issued are central government securities. The liability to pay these is from the GST compensation cess.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which means that is the money that was due to the states.
Yeah.
So one part of the GST compensation cess, which would have otherwise gone to the states, is now going to go to the center or to the holders of these securities, and therefore raise their top line.
Okay.
This is something that people have not noticed, and I've been banging on about this, but that's okay. I mean, one can compromise on these things. We are one country in the end, so beyond the point, it's unproductive to go through these. But could you please put up that slide, because I want to challenge it? You just put up a slide.
Yes. This is the borrowing. There you go, Dr. Roy.
I want to point out to your viewers that this is again an example of, I don't know what kind of bureaucratic gremlin in the Ministry of Finance constantly leads them to play silly games, which will be caught out. Of course, general government borrowings will increase by this step.
Yeah.
Then they are speculating in the second sentence, and you note the word likely, to borrow ungrammatical, I'm sorry, not me, Finance Ministry, a considerably lesser amount from the additional borrowing facility. That's a speculation.
No, not only
And
is it a speculation, Dr. Roy, it's incorrect, because yesterday they said that the states who have opted for option one are being given an unconditional nod to borrow the additional 0.5%. So it's actually incorrect, not just sort of speculative.
absolutely. And it is also, it's also extremely sort of specious. Anyone can cash it out. That the general government deficit increases if states borrow. So which general government deficit are they talking about? The projected general government deficit next year, or the general government deficit as budgeted in the last budget? That will definitely increase. So I don't understand why we have to play these pointless games time and again. And on that point, I also want to say that it is extremely unfortunate that this was not done in one shot. I'm glad the political input has now come for this change in stance, but somebody has to be accountable. This is happening far too often in the Ministry of Finance. That something is done and then a reversal is made. A few weeks ago, they said that actually the total borrowing that they will allow will be less than what they first announced, because it's normally there's a 2-month rollover. Now you already knew that when you issued the first circular, or you forgot, or what? That is not how you run a country's Ministry of Finance, and this is again happening. And this really worries me. This level of sort of inaccurate depiction of things, which can very easily be caught. I can sit here in my living room and catch it. Imagine the rating agencies and others, and what that does to the credibility and competence of India's reputation on the fiduciary and fiscal front. That is what really worries me in terms of the mechanics of how this is going. We can't go on issuing circulars and then correcting them. That luxury you do not have. In a crisis, that luxury you do not have when the country's fiduciary credibility comes into question. I want to make that point very strongly. While I'm grateful that the political input has come, it is very important to establish accountability now in the finance ministry as to why this is repeatedly happening.
No, absolutely. And another point I want to raise, Dr. Roy, linked to this, all of these increased borrowings that the center has permitted states, they seem to have too much conditionality attached to them, and conditionalities which are priorities of the center. I mean, at the first instance, when they said we'll allow you to do 5% of GSTP instead of 3%, they had, micro schemes that if you meet this, one nation, one ration card, etc., we will allow you to borrow. Now they said that if you pick option one, which was the preference from the center side, we will allow you to borrow. Is this appropriate?
I think because you're doing that additional borrowing to basically compensate for the shortfall in the divisible pool of tax revenues, right?
Yeah.
And if you're doing it for that reason, then you have to be very careful how they spend the money. So the principle of it is, I don't have a problem with. I have a problem with two things. The center has not demonstrated its ability to spend its money wisely, well, or efficiently either. In fact, the states have a better track record. And the second is that these things should be done after consultation with the states. And that consultation should be visibly demonstrable in the public domain by the states saying we were consulted and we are comfortable with this process. The states have not said that. And therefore, I am disappointed that these things are being done unilaterally, one. And two, that the center is not issuing equal restraints on its own behavior, given that its track record of public spending is not exemplary either. The center is not a superior spending entity within this intergovernmental framework. Everyone knows that. Some states are, in fact, far better than the center. The center runs 2/3 of the center's borrowing or more is for the revenue deficit. We know that. So it's not as if the center has a great reputation for fiscal prudence. And therefore, if the center had done this and also imposed some self-constraints on its incremental borrowing voluntarily, no one can expect the sovereign to do otherwise, then I think the situation would have been more palatable than this, which is again an example like the lockdown of a top-down, non-consultative approach. However legitimate or laudable the aims may be, it's bad governance.
Dr. As things stand, again, zooming out to the big picture, this is not a very large amount in the broader scheme of things. 1.1 lakh crore is being allowed for additional being given to states. But I think it's become very clear halfway into the year that there is just no fiscal capacity to support the economy at this point in time at all. Whether it's at the center level and now at the state level, I think the Q1 numbers had shown how sharply they've had to pull back on capex. Borrowings for some states are up almost 100%. So the capacity at a fiscal level, center plus state, is just not there to support an economy in a crisis like this.
The reason why we've had such a bad Q, negative 20, whatever growth, etc., was that the fiscal capacity that is there was not used. So these things have a habit of coming back to bite you. Early and prompt corrective action, as I've been arguing right from the beginning, to provide income support and to provide support to working capital. So you provide the two factors of production, labor and working capital, would have, I think, considerably ameliorated the aggregate demand problem that we are seeing. I don't believe in high frequency indicators, so I'm only going to discuss the year. It is fairly clear that we are going to end up with an economy that's between 9 and 15% smaller than it was earlier. Now, the question is, if you believe that increasing fiscal spending between now and next March will lower that shrinkage, and if you tell me what is it, what you're going to do it, then I can find you the money. There is plenty of money, even before we go for things like monetization. But that the credibility of that spending is linked to my ability to find the money. To give you an example of one of my favorite instruments, a console or a perpetual, the European Union has effectively done that. But that has been accompanied by 30 to 40-page spending plan that tells you what spending will happen in the next 3 years, how that spending will therefore improve the fisc, and therefore why these consoles are a good business case. You don't just borrow without a business case. At this time, we are having this conversation about borrowing or about capacity without the business case. What does the government want to spend on other than LTC, which is not incremental spending anyway? I don't know. If you want to spend on infrastructure, then I've got to ask you, what kind of infrastructure projects will actually yield you these demand or even supply side returns by the end of March? So therefore, you're saying basically that you're going to boost growth next year if you invest in infra this year. I need to see the plan. There is no plan. It's all talk in the air. Shovel ready, other such adjectives are used. Where is the concrete plan that other countries have actually provided? Detailed spending battle plan. Once you have that, you can allocate or find finance. Just like a firm, just like a company. If a company goes to a bank and says, I want to borrow, they're not going to get much of a hearing. That's what effectively is happening now. So you want to borrow for X, Y, Z. That will result in these investments. These investments will improve my balance sheet and my cash flow and my P&L over a 3-year period, and that's my business case. So where is the government of India's business case?
But I don't think there's an intention either, right? I mean, if halfway through the year there was a plan to say, okay, we are going to do some monetization or some special instrument like console, they would have probably done it by now. What we got in the second or third round of the fiscal stimulus was net spending of 0.2% of GDP, and so convoluted that I think most people believe it will have marginal at best impact on consumer spending in the festive season.
Absolutely. So basically, we have accepted that the economy is going to shrink by between 9 and 14% in real terms this year, by depending on who you believe. And the government of India has proclaimed that it is not able to, or is not willing to, I think it is not able to do anything about it.
Yeah, looks like it. And then I guess the only compensating factor is monetary policy, which, it'll do what it can, but it's sort of pulling on a string or pushing on a string.
Yeah. Monetary policy has its limit. Basically, what monetary policy can do is make the cost of capital cheaper and make access to capital more effective. But you have to have a plan about what people are going to do with that capital. And I see no plan. There is very simply no plan, which is why the government of India has not yet come out with even a projection of what they think growth will be next year or the year after. And the RBI has only seen fit to do it after just about everybody else, including me and the World Bank.
Absolutely. Dr. Roy, I'll leave it at that, unless you want to throw away some last thoughts on this entire GST tussle and center-state relations. But it does look like they've tried to ease things a little bit. They had become too acrimonious.
I think that what the government of India did was very good. I would like to congratulate them. I would urge everybody not to use confrontational language like concede or, I think there is a technical argument for doing something more than halfway. But I think at this stage, we must acknowledge that having put those technical arguments forward, the government of India has indicated that this is now fundamentally a political negotiation, which is a very good thing. And we should therefore let the government of India and the states move forward constructively and negotiate this. And may I just add one last throwaway? Also continue the spirit of political negotiation when the Finance Commission's award comes out very shortly in these very difficult times. And there I would submit to the government of India very humbly that instead of the traditional route of exposing the Finance Commission's report one day before the budget, it is presented in the next parliament session so that the states have a good look at it and there's a productive conversation in these extraordinary times on the recommendations that would be set forth there. Because remember, with the Finance Commission report, the states have no say in accepting it or not. It is only the center. The states have never objected to that, and I hope it stays that way. But it will require some political energy to make sure that that happens in this fraught environment.
No, absolutely. That's the next big event coming up on center-state relations. Thanks so much, Dr. Roy. Always good to talk to you and get your clarity on how this plays out. Appreciate your views. Thanks for watching BloombergQuint. Do go onto the site. We'll have Dr. Roy's interview up there very shortly.